Hello and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live. We are continuing today with the story of Rebecca. And here to read Rebecca is Amy B. How are you this morning?
I am very well. How are you doing?
I am well. So where are we now in the story? What's happening? What's new?
Logistically, we're on chapter 6. So if you are, this is again the version that I'm reading from. So we're on chapter 6. We have just spent 2 weeks daily with Mr. De Winters. And Stanley would like to know if we are reading Rebecca. Yes, Mr. Stanley, we are reading
Yes,
Rebecca.
we are
today.
indeed reading Rebecca. Yes.
So thank you for. He was like, I don't want to miss anything. And neither do I. I was just saying, like, all I want to do is sit and read this book, and I'm trying to just harn our patience and say no. So we just spent 2 weeks writing daily out with Mr. De Winter. He has started to give a little bit of clues about his previous life. You can also tell a little bit that he's starting to figure out where. We don't know her first or last name. The second Mrs. De Winters is going to fit into his life. And we now know that his name is Maxim. And yeah. And the last time we saw him and her, he kissed her hand in farewell. So,
what a gentleman.
Yes. We shall see. We shall see if they see each other again now that Mrs. Van Hopper is recovered from her flu, which she didn't really have. Just wanted the attention, like all high society, middle-aged ladies in the 30s. They just want attention. So yeah, we're starting to move along, trippingly.
Excellent. And you're beginning with chapter 6 today.
Chapter 6. Yeah. Boom.
Excellent.
Off we go. Yes.
I will turn things over to you and take us into Storyland.
Yes. Thank you so much, Bo.
Thank you.
Rebecca. Chapter 6. Packing up, the nagging worry of departure, lost keys, unwritten labels, tissue paper lying on the floor. I hate it all. Even now, when I have done so much of it, when I live, as the saying goes, in my boxes. Even today, when shutting drawers and flinging wide a hotel wardrobe, or the impersonal shelves of a furnished villa is methodical matter of routine, I am aware of sadness, of a sense of loss. Here I say we have lived, we have been happy. This has been ours, however brief the time. Though 2 nights only have been spent beneath the roof, yet we leave something of ourselves behind. Nothing material, not a hairpin on a dressing table, not an empty bottle of aspirin tablets, not a handkerchief beneath a pillow, but something indefinable, a moment of our lives, a thought, a mood. This house sheltered us. We spoke, we loved within these walls. That was yesterday. Today we pass on. We see it no more, and we are different, changed in some infinitesimal way. We can never be quite the same again. Even stopping for luncheon at a wayside inn and going to a dark, unfamiliar room to wash my hands, the handle of the door unknown to me, the wallpaper peeling in strips, a funny little cracked mirror above the basin. For this moment, it is mine. It belongs to me. We know one another. This is the present. There is no past and no future. Here I am washing my hands, and the cracked mirror shows me to myself, suspended, as it were, in a time. This is me. This moment will not pass. And then I open the door and go into the dining room where he is sitting waiting for me at a table. And I think how in that moment I have aged and passed on, how I have advanced one step toward an unknown destiny. We smile, we choose our lunch. We speak of this and that, but I say to myself, I am not she who left him 5 minutes ago. She stayed behind. I am another woman, older, more mature. I saw in a paper the other day that the Hotel Côte d'Azur at Monte Carlo had gone into new management and had a different name. The rooms had been redecorated and the whole interior changed. Perhaps Mrs. Van Hopper's suite on the first floor exists no more. Perhaps there is no trace of the small bedroom that was mine. I knew I should never go back that day I knelt on the floor and fumbled with the awkward catch in her trunk. The episode was finished with the snapping of the lock. I glanced out the window, and it was like turning the page of a photograph album. Those rooftops and the sea were mine no more. They belonged to yesterday, to the past. The rooms already wore an empty air, stripped of our possessions, and there was something hungry about the suite, as though it wished us gone and the new arrivals, who would come tomorrow, in our place. The heavy luggage stood strapped and locked in the corridor outside. The smaller stuff would be finished later. Waste paper baskets groaned under litter, all her half-empty medicine bottles and discarded face cream jars with torn-up bills and letters. Drawers in tables gaped. The bureau was stripped bare. She had flung a letter at me the morning before as I poured her coffee out at breakfast. Helen is sailing for New York on Saturday. Little Nancy has a threatening appendix, and they've cabled her to go home. That's decided me. We're going too. I'm tired to death of Europe, and we can come back in the early fall. How do you like the idea of seeing New York? The thought was worse than prison. Something of my misery must have shown in my face, for at first she looked astonished, then annoyed. What an odd, unsatisfactory child you are. I can't make you out. Don't you realize that at home girls in your position without any money can have the grandest fun? Plenty of boys and excitement, all in your own class. You can have your own little set of friends, and need to be at my beck and call as much as you are. I thought you didn't care for Monty. I've gotten used to it, I said lamely, wretchedly, my mind a conflict. Well, you'll just have to get used to New York, that's all. We're going to catch that boat of Helen's, and it means seeing about our passage at once. Go down to the reception office right away and make that young clerk show some sign of efficiency. Your day will be so full that you won't have time to have any pangs about leaving Monty. She laughed disagreeably, squashing her cigarette in the butter, and went to the telephone to ring up all her friends. But I could not face the office right away. I went into the bathroom and locked the door, and sat down on the cork mat, my head in my hands. It had happened at last, the business of going away. It was all over. Tomorrow evening I should be in the train, holding her jewel case and her rug like a maid, and she and that monstrous new hat with the single quill, dwarfed in her fur coat, sitting opposite me on the wagonlet. We would wash and clean the splashed basin, We would wash and clean our teeth in that stuffy little compartment with the rattling doors, the splashed basin, the damp towel, the soap with a single hair on it, the carafe half filled with water, the inevitable notice on the wall, Sous lavabo le trois un vase, while every little rattle, every throb and jerk of the screaming train would tell me that the miles carried me away from him. Sitting alone in the restaurant of the hotel, at the table I had known, reading a book, not minding, not thinking. I should say goodbye to him in the lounge, perhaps, before we left. A furtive, scrambled farewell because of her, and there would be a pause and a smile, and words like, "Yes, of course, do write," and "I never thanked you properly for being so kind," and his, "You must forward those snapshots. What about your address? Well, I'll have to let you know." And he would light a cigarette casually, asking a passing waiter for a light, while I thought, 4.5 minutes to go. I shall never see him again. Because I was going. Because it was over. There would suddenly be nothing more to say. We would be strangers, meeting for the last and only time, while my mind clamored painfully, crying, "I love you so much. I'm terribly unhappy. This has never come to me before and never will again." But my face would be set in a prim, conventional smile. My voice would be saying, "Look at that funny old man over there. I wonder who he is. He must be new here." And we would waste the last moments laughing at a stranger because we were already strangers to one another. I hope the snapshots come out well, repeating oneself in desperation, and he, "Yes, that one of the square ought to be good. The light was just right." Having both of us gone into all that time, having agreed upon it, and anyway, I would not care if the result was fogged and black, because this was the last moment. The final goodbye had been attained. "Well," my dreadful smile stretching across my face, "thanks most awfully once again. It's been so ripping," using words I had never used before. Ripping, what does it mean? God knows, and I did not care. It was a sort of word that schoolgirls had for hockey, wildly inappropriate to those past weeks of misery and exaltation. Then the doors of the lift would open upon Mrs. Van Hopper, and I would cross out to the lounge to meet her, and he would stroll back again to his corner and pick up a paper. Sitting there, ridiculously, on the cork mat of the bathroom floor, I lived it all, and our journey too, and our arrival in New York. The shrill voice of Helen, the narrower edition of her mother, and Nancy, her horrid little child. The college boys that Mrs. Van Hopper would have me know, and the young bank clerks suitable to my station. "Let's make Wednesday night a date. Do you like hot music? Snub-nosed boys with shiny faces, having to be polite and wanting to be alone with my own thoughts as I was now, locked in the bathroom door. She came and rattled on the door. "What are you doing?" "All right, I'm sorry, I'm coming now." And I made a pretense of turning on the tap, of bustling about and folding a towel on a rail. She glanced at me curiously as I opened the door. "What a time you've been! You can't afford to dream this morning, you know. There's too much to be done." He would go back to Manderley, of course, in a few weeks. I felt certain of that. There would be a great pile of letters waiting for him in the hall, and mine amongst them, scribbled on the boat. A forced letter, trying to amuse, describing my fellow passengers. It would lie about beside his blotter, and he would answer it weeks later, one Sunday morning in a hurry, before lunch, having come across it when he paid some bills. And then no more. Nothing until the final degradation of the Christmas card. Manderley itself, perhaps, against a frosted background. The message printed saying, "A happy Christmas and a prosperous New Year from Maximilian de Winter." Gold lettering. But to be kind, he would have run his pen through the printed name and written in ink underneath it, "From Maxim," a sort of sop, as if there was space, a message. "I hope you are enjoying New York." A lick of the envelope, a stamp, and tossed in a pile of 100 others. "It's too bad you are leaving tomorrow," said the reception clerk, telephone in hand. "The ballet starts next week, you know. Does Mrs. Van Hopper know?" I dragged myself back from Christmas at Manderley of the realities of the wagonlet. Mrs. Van Hopper lunched in the restaurant for the first time since her influenza, and I had a pain in the pit of my stomach as I followed her into the room. He had gone to Cannes for the day, that much I knew, for he had warned me the day before, but I kept thinking the waiter might commit an indiscretion and say, "Will mademoiselle be dining with monsieur tonight as usual?" Felt a little sick whenever he came near the table, but he said nothing. The day was spent in packing, and in the evening people came to say goodbye. We dined in the sitting room, and she went to bed directly afterwards. Still, I had not seen him. I went down to the lounge about 9:30 on the pretext of getting luggage labels, and he was not there. The odious reception clerk smiled when he saw me. "If you are looking for Mr. De Winter, we had a message from Cannes to say he would not be back before midnight." "I want a pack of luggage labels," I said, but I saw by his eye that he was not deceived. So there would be no last evening after all. The hour I had looked forward to all day must be spent by myself alone, in my own bedroom, gazing at my Revelation suitcase and at the stout hold-all. Perhaps it was just as well, for I should have made a poor companion, and he must have read my face. I know I cried that night, bitter, youthful tears that could not come from me today. That kind of crying, deep into a pillow, does not happen after we are 21. The throbbing head, the swollen eyes, the tight, contracted throat, and the wild anxiety in the morning to hide all traces from the world, sponging with cold water, dabbing eau de cologne with a furtive dash of powder that is significant in itself. The panic, too, that one might cry again, the tears swelling without control, and a fatal trembling of the mouth led one to disaster. I remember opening wide my window and leaning out, hoping the fresh morning air would blow away the telltale pink under the powder, and the sun never seemed so bright, nor the day so full of promise. Monte Carlo was suddenly full of kindliness and charm, the one place in the world that held sincerity. I loved it. Affection overwhelmed me. I wanted to live there all my life, and I was leaving it today. This was the last time I brushed my hair before the looking glass, the last time I shall clean my teeth into the basin. Never again sleep in that bed. Never more turn off the switch of that electric light. There I was, padding about in a dressing gown, making a slough of sentiment about a commonplace hotel bedroom. "You haven't started cold, have you?" she said at breakfast. "No," I told her. "I don't think so," clutching at a straw, for this might serve as an excuse later if I was over pink about the eyes. "I hate banging about once everything is packed," she grumbled. "We ought to have decided on the earlier train. We could get it if we made the effort, and then we'd have longer in Paris. Wire Helen not to meet us, but arrange another rendezvous. I wonder," she glanced at her watch, "I suppose they could change the reservation. Anyway, it's worth trying. Go down to the office and see." "Yes," I said, a dummy to her moods, going into my bedroom and flinging off my dressing gown, fastening my inevitable flannel skirt, and stretching my homemade jumper over my head. My indifference to her turned to hatred. This was the end, then. Even my mourning must be taken from me. No last half hour on the terrace, not even 10 minutes perhaps, to say goodbye, because she had finished breakfast earlier than she expected, because she was bored. Well then, I would fling away restraint and modesty. I would not be proud any more. I slammed the door of his sitting room and ran along the passage. I did not wait for the lift. I climbed the stairs, 3 at a time, up to the 3rd floor. I knew the number of his room, 148, and I hammered at the door, very flushed in the face and breathless. "Come in," he shouted, and I opened the door, repenting already, my nerve failing me, for perhaps he had just woken up, having been late last night, and would still be in bed, tousled in the head and irritable. He was shaving by the open window, a camel hair jacket over his pajamas, and I, in my flannel suit and heavy shoes, felt clumsy and overdressed. I was merely foolish when I had thought myself dramatic. "What do you want?" he said. "Is something the matter?" "I've come to say goodbye. We're going this morning." He stared at me, then put his razor down on the washstand. "Shut the door." I closed it behind me and stood there, rather self-conscious, my hands hanging by my side. "What on earth are you talking about?" he asked. "It's true. We're leaving today. We were going by the later train, and now she wants to catch the earlier one, and I was afraid I shouldn't see you again. I felt I must see you before I left. Thank you." They tumbled out, the idiotic words, just as I had imagined them. I was stiff and awkward. In a moment, I should say he had been ripping. "Why didn't you tell me about this before?" he said. "She only decided yesterday. It was all done in a hurry. Her daughter sails for New York on Saturday, and we were going with her. We're joining her in Paris and then on to Cherbourg." "She's taking you with her to New York?" "Yes, and I don't want to go. I shall hate it. I shall be miserable." "Why, in heaven's name, go with her then?" "I have to. You know that. I work for a salary. I can't afford to leave her." He picked up his razor and took the soap off his face. "Sit down," he said. "I shan't be long. I'll dress in the bathroom and be ready in 5 minutes." He took his clothes off the chair and threw them on the bathroom floor and went inside, slamming the door. I sat down on the bed and began biting my nails. The situation was unreal, and I felt like a lay figure. I wondered what he was thinking, what he was going to do. I glanced around the room, and it was the room of any man, untidy and impersonal. Lots of shoes, more than were ever needed, and strings of ties. The dressing table was bare, except for a large bottle of hair wash and a pair of ivory hair brushes. No photographs, no snapshots, nothing like that. And instinctively, I had looked for them, thinking there would be one photograph at least beside his bed or in the middle of the mantelpiece, one large in a leather frame. There were only books, though, and a box of cigarettes. He was ready, as he had promised, in 5 minutes. "Come down to the terrace while I eat my breakfast," he said. I looked at my watch. "I haven't time," I told him. "I ought to be in the office now, changing the reservations." "Never mind about that. I've got to talk to you," he said. We walked down the corridor and rang for the lift. He can't realize, I thought, that the early train leaves in about an hour and a half. Mrs. Van Hopper will ring up the office in a moment and ask if I'm there. We went down the lift, not talking, and out to the terrace where the tables were laid for breakfast. "What are you going to have?" he said. "I had mine already, and I can only stay 4 minutes anyway." "Bring me coffee, a boiled egg, toast, marmalade, and a tangerine," he said to the waiter. And he took an empty board out of his pocket and began emery board out of his pocket and began filing his nails. "So Mrs. Van Hopper has had enough of Monte Carlo," he said, "and now she wants to go home." "So do I. She to New York and I to Manderley." "Which would you prefer? You take your choice." "Don't make a joke about it. It's unfair. And I think I had better see about those tickets and say goodbye now." "If you think I'm one of the people who try to be funny at breakfast, you're wrong. I'm invariably ill-tempered in the early morning. I repeat to you, the choice is open to you. Either you go to America with Mrs. Van Hopper, or you come home to Manderley with me." "Do you mean you want a secretary or something?" "No, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool." The waiter came with the breakfast, and I sat with my hands on my lap, waiting while he put down the pot of coffee and the jug of milk. "You don't understand," I said when the waiter had gone. "I'm not the sort of person men marry." "The devil do you mean?" he said, staring at me, laying down his spoon. I watched a fly settle on the marmalade, and he brushed it away impatiently. "I'm not sure," I said slowly. "I don't think I know how to explain. I don't belong to your sort of world, for one thing. What is my world? Well, Manderley. You know what I mean. He picked up his spoon again and helped himself to marmalade. You are almost as ignorant as Mrs. Van Hopper, and just as unintelligent. What do you know of Manderley? I'm the person to judge that, whether you belong there or not. You think I ask you this on the spur of the moment, don't you? Because you say you don't want to go to New York. You think I asked you to marry me for the same reason you believed I drove you about in the car, yes, and gave you dinner that first evening. To be kind, don't you? Yes, I said. One day, he went on, spreading his toast thick, you may realize that philanthropy is not my strongest quality. At the moment, I don't think you realize anything at all. You haven't answered my question. Are you going to marry me? I don't believe, even in the fiercest moments, I had considered this possibility. I had once, when driving with him, and we had been silent for many miles, started a rambling story in my head about him being very ill, delirious, I think, and sending for me, and I having to nurse him. I had reached the point in my story where I was putting eau de cologne on his head when we arrived at the hotel, and so it finished there. And another time, I had imagined living in a lodge on the grounds of Manderley, and how he would visit me sometimes and sit in front of the fire. This sudden talk of marriage bewildered me, even shocked me, I think. It was as though the king asked one. It did not ring true. And he went on eating his marmalade as though everything were natural. In books, men knelt to women, and it would be moonlight. Not at breakfast, not like this. My suggestion doesn't seem to have gone too well, he said. I'm sorry. I rather thought you loved me. Fine blow to my conceit. I do love you, I said. I love you dreadfully. You've made me very unhappy, and I've been crying all night because I thought I should never see you again. When I said this, I remember he laughed and stretched his hand to me across the breakfast table. Bless you for that, he said. One day, when you reach that exalted age of 35, which you told me was your ambition, I'll remind you of this moment, and you won't believe me. It's a pity you have to grow up. I was ashamed already and angry with him for laughing. So women did not make these confessions to men. I had a lot to learn. So that's settled, isn't it? He said, going on with his toast and marmalade. Instead of being a companion to Mrs. Van Hopper, you become mine, and your duties will be almost exactly the same. I also like new library books and flowers in the drawing room and bezique after dinner, and someone to pour out my tea. The only difference is that I don't take Taxol, I prefer Ennos, and you must never let me run out of my particular brand of toothpaste. I drummed with my fingers on the table, uncertain of myself and of him. Was he still laughing at me? Was it all a joke? He looked up and saw the anxiety in my face. I'm being rather brute to you, aren't I? He said. This isn't your idea of a proposal. We ought to be in a conservatory, you in a white frock with a rose in your hand and a violin playing a waltz in the distance. And I should make violent love to you behind a palm tree. You would feel then you were getting your money's worth. Poor darling, what a shame. Never mind, I'll take you to Venice for our honeymoon and we'll hold hands in the gondola. But we won't stay too long because I want to show you Manderley. He wanted to show me Manderley. And suddenly I realized that it would all happen. I would be his wife, and we would walk in the garden together. We would stroll down that path in the valley to the shingle beach. I knew how I would stand in the steps after breakfast, looking out at the day, throwing crumbs to the birds, and later wander about in a shady hat with long scissors in my hand and cut flowers for the house. I knew now why I had brought this picture postcard as a child. It was a premonition, a blank step into the future. He wanted to show me Manderley. My mind ran riot then. Figures came before me, and picture after picture, and all the while he ate his tangerine, giving me a piece now and then and watching me. We would be in a crowd of people, and he would say, I don't think you've met my wife. Mrs. De Winter. I would be Mrs. De Winter. I considered my name, and the signature on checks to tradesmen, and in letters asking people to dinner. I heard myself talking on the telephone. Why not come down to Manderley next weekend? People. Always a throng of people. Oh, but she's simply charming. You must meet her. This about me. A whisper on the fringe of a crowd, and I would turn away, pretending I had not heard. Going down to the lodge with a basket in my arm, grapes and peaches for the old lady who was sick. her hands stretched out to me. "The Lord bless you, madam, for being so good." And me saying, "Just send up to the house for anything you want." Mrs. De Winter. I would be Mrs. De Winter. I saw the polished table in the dining room and the long candles. Maxim sitting at the end, a party of 24. I had a flower in my hair. Everyone looked towards me, holding up his glass. "We must drink to the health of the bride." And Maxim saying afterward, "I have never seen you look so lovely." Great cool rooms filled with flowers. My bedroom with a fire in the winter. Someone knocking at the door, and a woman comes in smiling. She's Maxim's sister, and she is saying, It's really wonderful how happy you have made him. Everyone is so pleased. You are such a success." Mrs. De Winter. I would be Mrs. De Winter. "The rest of the tangerine is sour. I shouldn't eat it," he said, and I stared at him, the words going slowly to my head, then looked at the fruit at my plate. The quarter was hard and pale. He was right. The tangerine was very sour. I had a sharp, bitter taste in my mouth, and I had only just noticed it. "Am I going to break the news to Mrs. Van Hopper, or are you?" He was folding his napkin, pushing back his plate, and I wondered how it was he spoke so casually, as though the matter was of little consequence, a mere adjustment of plans, whereas to me it was a bombshell exploding into 1,000 fragments. "You tell her. She'll be so angry." We got up from the table, I excited and flushed, trembling already in anticipation. I wondered if he would tell the waiter, take my arm smilingly and say, "You must congratulate us, mademoiselle and I are going to be married." And all the other waiters would hear, would bow to us, would smile, and we would pass into the lounge, a wave of excitement following us, a flutter of anticipation. But he said nothing. He left the terrace without a word, and I followed him to the lift. We passed the reception desk, and no one even looked at us. The clerk was busy with a sheaf of papers. He was talking over his shoulder to his junior. He does not know, he thought, that I am going to be Mrs. De Winter. I am going to live at Manderley. Manderley will belong to me. He went up in the lift to the first floor, and so along the passage. He took my hand and swung it as we went along. "Does 42 seem very old to you?" he said. "Oh, no," I told him quickly, too eagerly, perhaps. "I don't like young men." "You've never known any." We came to the door of the suite. "I think I had better deal with this alone. Tell me something. Do you mind how soon you marry me? You don't want a trousseau, do you, or any of that nonsense? Because the whole thing can be easily arranged in a few days, over a desk with a license, and then off in the car to Venice or anywhere you fancy." "Not in a church? Not in a white with bridesmaids and bells and choir boys? What about your relations and all your friends?" "You forget," he said. "I had that sort of wedding before." We went on standing in front of the door of the suite, and I noticed that the daily paper was still thrust through the letterbox. We had been too busy to read it at breakfast. "Well," he asked, "what about it?" "Of course," I said. "I was thinking about the moment we would be married at home. Naturally, I don't expect a church or people or anything like that." And I smiled at him. I made a cheerful face. "Won't it be fun?" I said. He had turned to the door, though, and opened it, and we were inside the suite in the little entrance passage. "Is that you?" called Mrs. Van Hopper from the sitting room. "What in the name of Mike have you been doing? I've rung the office 3 times, and they said they hadn't seen you." I was seized with a sudden desire to laugh, to cry, to do both, and I had a pain, too, at the pit of my stomach. I wished for one wild moment that none of this had happened, that I was alone somewhere, going for a walk and whistling. "I'm afraid it is all my fault," he said, going into the sitting room, shutting the door behind him, and I heard her exclamation of surprise. Then I went into my bedroom and sat by the open window. It was like waiting in the anteroom of a doctor's. I had to turn over the pages of a magazine, look at photographs that did not matter, and read articles I should never remember, until the nurse came, bright and efficient, all humanity washed away by years of disinfectant. "It's all right. The operation was quite successful. There's no need to worry at all. I should go home and have some sleep." The walls of the suite were thick. I could hear no hum of voices. I wondered what he was saying to her, how he phrased his words. Perhaps he said, "I fell in love with her, you know, the very first time we met. We've been seeing one another every day." And she in answer, "Why, Mr. De Winter, it's quite the most romantic thing I have ever heard." Romantic. That was the word I had tried to remember coming up in the lift. Yes, of course, romantic. That is what people would say. It was all very sudden and romantic. They suddenly decided to get married, and there it was, such an adventure. I smiled to myself as I hugged my knees on the window seat, thinking how wonderful it was, how happy I was going to be. I was to marry the man I loved. I was to be Mrs. De Winter. It was foolish to go on having that pain in the pit of my stomach when I was so happy. Nerves, of course, waiting like this, the doctor's anteroom. It would have been better, after all, more natural, surely, to have gone into the sitting room, hand in hand, laughing, smiling at one another, and for him to say, "We're going to be married. We're very much in love." Love. He had not said anything yet about being in love. No time, perhaps. He was also hurried at the breakfast table. Marmalade and coffee and that tangerine. No time. The tangerine was very bitter. No, he had not said anything about being in love, just that we would be married. Short, definite. Original. Original proposals were much better, more genuine. Not like other people. Not like younger men who talked nonsense, probably not meaning half they said. Not like younger men being incoherent, very passionate, swearing impossibilities. Not like the first time, asking Rebecca. No, I must not think of that. Put it away. A thought forbidden, prompted by demons. Get thee behind me, Satan. I must never think of that. Never, never, never. He loves me. He wants to show me manfully. Why would they have done with their talking? Would they ever call me into the room? There was the book of poems lying beside my bed. He had forgotten he had ever lent him to me. Could not mean much to him then. Go on, whispered the demon. Open the title page. That's what you want to do, isn't it? Open the title page. Nonsense, I said. I'm only going to put the book with the rest of the things. I yawned, wandered to the table beside the bed, picked up the book, caught my foot in the flex of the bedside lamp and stumbled, the book falling from my hand on the floor. It fell open at the title page. Max, from Rebecca. She was dead, and one must not have thoughts about the dead. They slept in peace. The grass blew over their graves. How alive was her writing, though, how full of force. Those curious sloping letters, the blob of ink, done yesterday. It was just as if it had been written yesterday. I took my nail scissors from the dressing case and cut the page, looking over my shoulder like a criminal. I cut the page right out of the book. I left no jagged edges, and the book looked white and clean when the page was gone. A new book that had not been touched. I tore the page up in many little fragments and threw them into the waste paper basket. Then I went and sat in the window seat again. But I kept thinking of the torn scraps in the basket, and after a moment I had to get up and look in the basket once more. Even now the ink stood up in the fragments, thick and black. The writing was not destroyed. I took a box of matches and set fire to the fragments. The flame had a lovely light, sustaining the paper, curling the edges, making the slanting writing impossible to distinguish. The fragments fretted to gray ashes. The letter R was the last to go. It twisted in the flame. It curled outward for a moment, becoming larger than ever. Then it crumpled, too. The flame destroyed it. It was not ashes even. It was feathery dust. I went and washed my hands in the basin. I felt better, much better. I had the clean, new feeling that one has when the calendar is hung on the wall in the beginning of the year. January 1st. I was aware of the same freshness, the same gay confidence. The door opened and he came into the room. All's well, he said. Shock made her speechless at first, but she's beginning to recover, so I'm going downstairs to the office to make certain she will catch the first train. For a moment she wavered. I think she had hopes of acting witness at the wedding, but I was very firm. Go and talk to her. He said nothing about being glad, about being happy. He did not take my arm and go into the sitting room with me. He smiled and waved his hand and went off down the corridor alone. I went to Mrs. Van Hopper, uncertain, rather self-conscious, like a maid who has handed in her notice through a friend. She was standing by the window, smoking a cigarette, an odd, dumpy little figure I should not see again. Her coat stretched tight over her large breasts, her ridiculous hat perched sideways on her head. Well, she said, her voice dry and hard, not the voice she would have used of him. I suppose I've got to hand it to you for a double-time worker. Still waters certainly run deep in your case. How did you manage it? I did not know what to answer. I did not like her smile. It was a lucky thing for you I had the influenza, she said. I realize now how you spent your days and why you were so forgetful. Tennis lessons, my eyes. You might have told me, you know. I'm sorry, I said. She looked at me curiously. She ran her eyes over my figure. And he tells me he wants to marry you in a few days. Lucky again for you, you haven't a family to ask questions. Well, it's nothing to do with me anymore. I wash my hands of the whole affair. I rather wonder what his friends will think you, but I suppose that's up to him. You realize he's years older than you. He's only 42, and I'm old for my age. She laughed. She dropped cigarette ash on the floor. You certainly are. She went on, looking at me in a way she had never done before, praising me, running her eyes over my points like a judge at a cattle show. There was something inquisitive about her eyes, something unpleasant. Tell me, she said, intimate, a friend to a friend, have you been doing anything you shouldn't? She was like Blaze, the dressmaker, who had offered me that 10%. I don't know what you mean, I said. She laughed. She shrugged her shoulders. Oh, well, never mind. But I always said English girls were dark horses for all their hockey-playing attitude. So I'm supposed to travel to Paris alone and leave you here while your beau gets a marriage license? I notice he didn't ask me to the wedding. I don't think he wants anyone, and anyway, you would have sailed. She said. She took out her vanity case and began powdering her nose. I suppose you really do know your own mind, she went on. After all, the whole thing's been very hurried, hasn't it? A matter of weeks? I don't suppose he's too easy, and you'll have to adapt yourself to his ways. You've led an extremely sheltered life up to now, you know, and you can't say that I've run you off your feet. You will have your work cut out as a mistress of Manderley. To be perfectly frank, my dear, I simply can't see you doing it. Her words sounded like the echo of my own an hour before. You haven't the experience, she continued. You don't know that milieu. You can scarcely string two sentences together at my bridge tees. What are you going to say to all of his friends? The Manderley parties were famous when she was alive. Of course, he told you all about them? I hesitated, but she went on, thank heaven, not waiting for my answer. Naturally, one wants you to be happy, and I grant you he's a very attractive creature, but, well, I'm sorry, and personally I think you are making a big mistake, one you will bitterly regret. She put down the box of powder and looked at me over her shoulder. Perhaps she was being sincere at last, but I did not want that sort of honesty. I did not say anything. I looked sullen, perhaps, for she shrugged her shoulders and wandered into the looking-glass, straightening her little mushroom hat. I was glad she was going, glad I should not see her again. I grudged the months I had spent with her, employed by her, taking her money, trotting in her wake like a shallow, drab, and dumb. Of course I was inexperienced. Of course I was idiotic, shy, and young. I knew all that. She did not have to tell me. I supposed her attitude was deliberate, and for some odd feminine reason, she resented this marriage. Her scale of values had received a shock. Well, I would not care. I would forget her and her barbed words. A new confidence had been born in me when I burnt that page and scattered the fragments. The past would not exist for either of us. We were starting afresh, he and I. The past had blown away like the ashes in the waste paper basket. I was going to be Mrs. De Winter. I was going to live at Manderley. Soon she would be gone, rattling alone in the wagon lit without me, and he and I would be together in the dining room of the hotel, lunching at the same table, planning the future, the brink of a big adventure. Perhaps when she had gone, he would talk to me at last, about loving me, about being happy. Up to now, there had been no time. And anyway, those things are not easily said. They must wait their moment. I looked up and caught her reflection in the looking-glass. She was watching me, a little tolerant smile on her lips. I thought she was going to be generous after all, hold out her hand and wish me luck, give me encouragement to tell me that everything was going to be all right. But she went on smiling, twisting a stray hair into place beneath her hat. Of course, she said, you know why he's marrying you, don't you? You haven't flattered yourself he's in love with you. The fact is, that empty house got on his nerves to such an extent he nearly went off his head. He admitted as much before you came into the room. He just can't go on living there alone. Chapter 7. We came to Manderley in early May, arriving, so Maxim said, with the first swallows and the bluebells. It would be the best moment before the full flush of summer, and in the valley the azaleas would be prodigal of scent, and the blood-red rhododendrons in bloom. We motored, I remember, leaving London in the morning on a heavy shower of rain, coming to Manderley about 5 o'clock in time for tea. I can see myself now, unsuitably dressed as usual, though a bride of 7 weeks, in a tan-colored stockinette frock, a small fur known as a stone marten around my neck, and over all a shapeless mackintosh, far too big for me and dragging at my ankles. It was, I thought, a gesture to the weather, and the length added inches to my height. I clutched a pair of gauntlet gloves in my hands and carried a large leather handbag. "This is London rain," said Maxim when we left. "You wait, the sun will be shining for you when we come to Manderley." He was right, for the clouds left us at Exeter. They rolled away behind us, leaving a great blue sky above our heads and a white road in front of us. I was glad to see the sun, for in superstitious fashion I looked upon rain as an omen of ill will, and the leaden skies of London had made me silent. "Feeling better?" said Maxim, and I smiled at him, taking his hand, wondering how easy it was for him, going to his own home, wandering into the hall, picking up letters, ringing a bell for tea, and I wondered how much he guessed of my nervousness, and whether his question, "Feeling better?" meant he understood. "Never mind, we'll soon be there. I expect you want your tea," he said, and he let go my hand because we had reached a bend in the road and must slow down. I knew then that he had mistaken my silence for fatigue, and it had not occurred to him I dreaded this arrival at Manderley as much as I had longed for it in theory. Now the moment was upon me, I wished it delayed. I wanted it to draw up at some wayside inn and stay there, in a coffee room, by an impersonal fire. I wanted to be a traveler on the road, a bride in love with her husband, not myself coming to Manderley for the first time, the wife of Maxim de Winter. We passed many friendly villages where the cotton windows gave a kindly air. A woman holding a baby in her arms smiled at me from a doorway, while a man clanked across a road to a well, carrying a pail. I wished we could have been one of them, perhaps our neighbors, and that Maxim could lean over a cottage gate in the evening, smoking a pipe, proud of a very tall hollyhock he had grown himself, while I bustled in my kitchen, clean as a pin, laying the table for supper. There would be an alarm clock on the dresser, ticking loudly, and a row of shining plates, while after supper Maxim would read his paper, boots on the fender, and I would reach for a great pile of mending in the dresser drawer. Surely it would be peaceful and steady, that way of living, and easier, too, demanding no set standard. "Only 2 miles further," said Maxim. "You see that great belt of trees on the bow of the hill there, sloping to the valley with a scrap of sea beyond? That's Manderley in there. Those are the woods." I forced a smile and did not answer him, aware now of a stab of panic, an uneasy sickness that cannot be controlled. Gone was my glad excitement, vanished my happy pride. I was like a child brought to her first school, or a little untrained maid who has never left home before seeking a situation. Any measure of self-possession I had gained hitherto during the brief 7 weeks of marriage was like a rag now, fluttering before in the wind. It seemed to me that even the most elementary knowledge of behavior was unknown to me now. I should not know my right hand from my left, whether to stand or sit, what spoons and forks to use at dinner. "I should shed that mackintosh," he said, glancing down at me. "It does not rain down here at all, and put your funny little fur straight. Poor lamb, I have bustled you down here like this, and you probably ought to have bought a lot of clothes in London." "It doesn't matter to me, as long as you don't mind," I said. "Most women think of nothing but clothes," he said, absently. And turning a corner, we came to a crossroad in the beginning of a high wall. "Here we are," he said, a new note of excitement in his voice, and I gripped the leather seat on the car with my 2 hands. The road curved, and before us, on the left, were 2 high iron gates beside a lodge, open wide to the long drive beyond. As we drove through, I saw faces peering through the dark window of the lodge, and a child ran around from the back, staring curiously. I shrank back against the seat, my heart beating quickly, knowing why the faces were at the window and why the child stared. They wanted to see what I was like. I could imagine them now, talking excitedly, laughing in the little kitchen. "Only caught slide at the top of her hat," they would say. "She wouldn't show her face. Oh, well, we'll know by tomorrow. Word will come from the house." Perhaps he gets something of my shyness, for at last he took my hand and kissed it, and laughed a little even as he spoke. "You mustn't mind if there's a certain amount of curiosity," he said. "Everyone will want to know what you are like. They've probably talked of nothing else for weeks." You've only got to be yourself and they will adore you. And you don't have to worry about the house. Miss Danver does everything. Just leave it all to her. She'll be stiff with you at first, I dare say. She's an extraordinary character, but you mustn't let it worry you. It's just her manner. See those shrubs? It's like a blue wall along here where the hydrangeas are in bloom. I did not answer him, for I was thinking of that self who long ago bought a picture postcard in a village shop and came out into the bright sunlight, twisting it into her hands, pleased with her purchase, thinking, "This will do for my album. Manderley, what a lovely name." And now I belonged here. This was my home. I would write letters to people saying, "We shall be down at Manderley all summer. You must come and see us." And I would walk along this drive, strange and unfamiliar to me now, with a perfect knowledge, conscious of every twist and turn, marking and approving where the gardeners had worked. Here a cutting back of the shrubs, there a loping of a branch, calling at the lodge by the iron gates on some friendly airy, saying, "How's the leg today?" while the old woman, curious no longer, bade me welcome to her kitchen. I envied Maxim, careless and at ease, and the little smile on his lips which meant he was happy to be coming home. It seemed remote to me, and far too distant, the time when I should smile and be at ease, and I wished it would come quickly, that I would be old even, with gray hair and slow of step, having lived here many years, but anything but the timid, foolish creature I felt myself to be. The gates had shut with a crash behind us. The dusty high road was out of sight, and I became aware that this was not the drive I imagined would be Manderley's. This was not a broad and spacious thing of gravel, flanked with neat turf on either side, kept smooth with rake and brush. This drive twisted and turned as a serpent, scarce wider than in the places than a path, and above our heads was a great colonnade of trees, whose branches nodded and intermingled with one another, making an archway for us, like the roof of a church. Even the midday sun would not penetrate the interlacing of those green leaves. They were too thickly entwined, one with another, and only little flickering patches of warm light would come into intermittent waves to dapple the drive with gold. It was very silent, very still. On the high road there had been a gay west wind blowing in my face, making the grass on the hedges dance in unison, but here there was no wind. Even the engine of the car had taken a new note, throbbing low, quieter than before. As the drive descended to the valley so the trees came into us, great beeches with lovely smooth white stems lifting their myriad branches to one another. And other trees I could not name, coming close, so close that I could touch them with my hands. On we went, over a little bridge that spanned a narrow stream, and still this drive that was no drive twisted and turned like an enchanted ribbon through the dark and silent woods, penetrating even deeper to the very heart, surely, of the forest itself. And still there was no clearing, no space to hold a house. The length of it began to nag my nerves. It must be this turn, I thought, around that further bend. But as I leant forward in my seat, I was forever disappointed. There was no house, no field, no broad and friendly garden, nothing but the silence and deep woods. The lodge gates were a memory, and the high road something belonged to another time, another world. Suddenly, I saw a clearing in the dark drive ahead and a patch of sky, and in a moment the dark trees had thinned, the nameless shrubs had disappeared, and on either side of us was a wall of color, blood red, reaching far above our heads. We were amongst the rhododendrons. There was something bewildering, even shocking, about the suddenness of their discovery. The woods had not prepared me for them. They startled me with their crimson faces, massed one upon the other in incredible profusion, showing no leaf, no twig, nothing but the slaughterhouse red, luscious and fantastic, unlike any rhododendron plant I had ever seen before. I glanced at Maxim. He was smiling. "Like them?" he said. I told him yes, a little breathlessly, uncertain whether I was speaking the truth or not, for to me a rhododendron was a homely, domestic thing, strictly conventional, mauve or pink in color, standing one beside the other in a nice, neat, round bed. These were monsters, rearing into the sky, massed like a battalion, too beautiful, I thought, too powerful. They were not plants at all. We were not far from the house now. I saw the drive broaden into the sweep I had expected, and with the blood-red wall still flanking us on either side, we turned the last corner and so came to Manderley. Yes, there it was, the Manderley I had expected, the Manderley of my picture postcard long ago. A thing of grace and beauty, exquisite and faultless, lovelier than I had ever dreamed, built in its hollow of smooth grassland and mossy lawns, the terraces sloping to the garden and the gardens to the sea. as we drove up to the wide stone steps and stopped before the open door. I saw through one of the mullioned windows that the hall was full of people, and I heard Maxim swear under his breath, "Damn that woman. She knows perfectly well I did not want this sort of thing." And he put on his brakes with a jerk. "What's the matter?" I said. "Who are all these people?" "I'm afraid you'll have to face it now," he said in irritation. "Mrs. Danvers has collected the whole damn staff in the house and on the estate to welcome us. It's all right. You won't have to say anything. I'll do it all." I fumbled with the handle of the door, feeling slightly sick and cold now, too, from the long drive. And I fumbled with the catch. The butler came down the steps, followed by a footman, and he opened the door for me. He was old. He had a kind face, and I smiled up at him, holding out my hand. But I don't think he could have seen, for he took the rug instead, and my small dressing case, and turned to Maxim, helping me from the car at the same time. "Well, here we are, Firth," said Maxim, taking off his gloves. Maybe it's Frith. We'll say Frith. "Well, here we are, Frith," said Maxim, taking off his gloves. "It was raining when we left London. You don't seem to have it here. Everything well?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. No, we have had a dry month on the whole. Glad to see you home, and I hope you have been keeping well, and madam, too." "Yes, we are both well, thank you, Frith. Rather tired from the drive and wanting our tea. I didn't expect this business." He jerked his head to the hall. "Mrs. Danvers' orders, sir," said the man, his face expressionless. "I might have guessed it," said Maxim abruptly. "Come on," he said, turning to me. "It won't take long, and then you shall have your tea." We went up together the flight of steps, Frith and the footman following with the rug and my mackintosh, and I was aware of a little pain at the pit of my stomach, a nervous contraction in my throat. I can close my eyes now and look back on it and see myself as I must have been, standing on the threshold of the house, a slim, awkward figure in my stockinette dress, clutching in my sticky hands a pair of gauntlet gloves. I can see the great stone hall, the wide doors open to the library, the Peter Lies and the Van Dykes on the walls, the exquisite staircase leading to the minstrel's gallery, and there, ranged one behind the other in the hall, overflowing to the stone passages to beyond, and the dining room, a sea of faces, open-mouthed and curious, gazing at me as though they were watching a crowd around the block, and I, the victim, with my hands tied behind my back. Someone advanced from the sea of faces, someone tall and gaunt, dressed in deep black, whose prominent cheekbones and great hollow eyes gave her a skull's face, parchment white, set on a skeleton's frame. She came towards me, and I held out my hand, envying her dignity and her composure. But when she took my hand, we got a lot to go. Hers was limp and heavy, deathly cold, and it lay in mine like a lifeless thing. "This is Mrs. Danvers," said Maxim. She began to speak, still having that dead hand in mine, and her hollow eyes never leaving my eyes, that so her own wavered and would not meet hers. And as they did so, her hand moved in mine, the life returning to it, and I was aware of a sensation of discomfort and of shame. I can't remember her name, her words now, but I know that she bade me welcome to Manderley, in the name of herself and the staff, a stiff, conventional speech rehearsed for the occasion, spoken in a voice as cold and lifeless as her hand had been. When she finished, she waited as though for a reply, and I remember blushing scarlet, stammering some sort of thanks in return, and dropping both my gloves in confusion. She stooped to pick them up, and as she handed them to me, I saw a little smile of scorn upon her lips, and I guessed at once she considered me ill-bred. Something in the expression of her face gave me a feeling of unrest. And even when she had stepped back and taken her place among the rest, I could see the black figure standing out alone, individual and apart, and for all her silence, I knew her eye to be upon me. Maxim took my arm and made a little speech of thanks, perfectly easy and free from embarrassment, as though the making of it was no effort to him at all. And then he bore me off to the library to tea, closing the doors behind us, and we were alone again. 2 Cocker Spaniels came from the fireside to greet us. They pawed at Maxim, their long silken ears strained back with affection, their nose questing his hands, and then they left him and came to me, sniffling at my heels, rather uncertain, rather suspicious. One was the mother, blind in one eye, and soon she had enough of me and took herself with a grunt to the fire again. But Jasper, the younger, put his nose into my hand and laid a chin upon my cheek, upon my knee, his eyes deep with meaning, his tail a thump-thump when I stroked his silken ears. I felt better when I had taken my hat off and my wretched little fur and thrown them both beside my gloves and my bag onto the window seat. It was a deep, comfortable room, with books lining the walls to the ceiling, the sort of room a man would move from never did he live alone, Solid chairs behind a great open fireplace, baskets for the 2 dogs in which I felt they never sat, for the hollows of the chairs had telltale marks. The long windows look out upon the lawns, and behind the lawns the distant shimmer of the sea. There was an old, quiet smell about the room, as though the air in it was little changed, for all that sweet lilac scent and the roses brought to it throughout an early summer. Whatever air came to this room, whether from the garden or from the sea, would lose its first freshness, becoming part of the unchanging room itself, one with the books, musty and never read, one with the scrolled ceiling, the dark paneling, the heavy curtains. It was an ancient, mossy smell, the smell of a silent church where services are seldom held, where rusty lichen grow upon the stones and ivy tendrils creep up to the very windows. A room for peace, a room for meditation. Soon tea was brought to us, a stately little performance enacted by Frith and the young footman, in which I played no part until they had gone. And while Maxim glanced through his great pile of letters, I played with 2 dripping crumpets, crumbled cake with my hands, and swallowed my scalding tea. Now again he looked up at me and smiled, and then returned to his letter. The accumulation of the last months, I suppose, and I thought how little I knew of his life here at Manderley. How it went on day by day, of the people he knew, of his friends, men and women, of what bills he paid, what orders he gave about his household. The last weeks had gone so swiftly, and I, driving by his side through France and Italy, thought only of how I loved him, seeing Venice with his eyes, echoing his words, asking no questions of the past and future, content with the little glory of the living present. For he was gayer than I had thought, more tender than I had dreamed, youthful and ardent in 100 happy ways, not the Maxim I had first met, not the stranger who sat alone at the table in the restaurant, staring before him, wrapped in his secret self. My Maxim laughed and sang, threw stones into the water, took my hand, wore no frown between his eyes, carried no burden on his shoulders. I knew him as a lover, as a friend, and during those weeks I had forgotten that he had a life orderly, methodical, a life which must be taken up again, continued as before, making vanished weeks a brief, discarded holiday. I watched him read his letters, saw him frown at one, smile at another, dismiss the next with no expression, and but for the grace of God, I thought my letter would be lying there, written from New York, and he would read it in the same indifferent fashion, puzzled at first perhaps by the signature, and then tossing it with a yawn to the pile of others into the basket, reaching for his cup of tea. The knowledge of this chilled me. How narrow a chance had stood between me and what might have been, for he would have sat there to his tea, as he sat now, continuing his home life as he would in any case, and perhaps he would not have thought of me much, not with regret anyway, while I, in New York, playing bridge with Mrs. Van Hopper, would wait day after day for a letter that never came. I leant back in my chair, glancing about the room, trying to instill into myself some measure of confidence, some genuine realization that I was here at Manderley, the house of the picture postcard, the Manderley that was famous. I had to teach myself that all this was mine now, mine as much as his. The deep chair I was sitting in, that mass of books stretching to the ceiling, the pictures on the wall, the gardens, the woods, the Manderley I had read about, all of this was mine now because I was married to Maxim. We should grow old here together. Should sit like this to our tea as an old couple, Maxim and I, with other dogs, the successor of these, and the library would wear the same ancient musty smell that it did now. It would know a period of glorious shabbiness and wear when the boys were young, our boys, for I saw them sprawling on the sofa with muddy boots, bringing with them always a litter of rods and cricket bats, great clasping knives, bows and arrows. On the table there, polished now and plain, an ugly case would stand containing butterflies and moths, and another with birds' eggs wrapped in cotton wool. Not all this junk in here, I would say. Take them to the schoolroom, darlings. And they would run off shouting, calling to one another. The little one staying behind, pottering on his own, quieter than the other. My vision was disturbed by the opening of the door, and Frith came in with the footman to clear the tea. Mrs. Danvers wonders, madam, whether you would like to see your room. Yes, he said to me when the tea had been taken away. Maxim glanced up from his letter. What sort of job have they made of the east wing? He said. Very nice indeed, sir. It seems to me. The men made a mess when they were working, of course, and for a time Mrs. Danvers was rather afraid it was not be finished by your return. but they cleared out last Monday. I should imagine you would be very comfortable there, sir, and a lot lighter, of course, on that side of the house. Have you been making alterations? I asked. Oh, nothing much, said Maxim briefly. Only redecorating and painting the suite in the east wing, which I thought we could use for ours. As Frith says, it's much more cheerful on that side of the house, and it has a lovely view of the rose garden. It was a visitor's wing when my mother was alive. I'll just finish these letters, and then I'll come up and join you. Run along and make friends with Mrs. Danvers. It's a good opportunity. I got up slowly, my nervousness returning, and went out to the hall. I wish I could have waited for him, and then, taking his arm, seen the rooms together. I did not want to go alone with Mrs. Danvers. How vast the great hall now looked. It was empty. My feet rang on the flagged stones, echoing to the ceiling, and I felt guilty at the sound, as one does in church, self-conscious, aware of the same constraint. My feet made a stupid pitter-patter as I walked, and I thought that Frith, with his felt soles, must have thought me foolish. It's very big, isn't it? I said, too brightly, too forced, a schoolgirl still, but he answered me in all solemnity. Yes, Madam, Manderley is a big place. Not so big as some, of course, but big enough. This was the old banqueting halls in old days. It is used still on great occasions, such as a big dinner or a ball, and the public are admitted here, you know, once a week. Yes, I said, still aware of my loud footsteps, feeling as I followed him that he considered me as he would one of the public visitors, and I behaved like a visitor, too, glancing politely to right and left, taking in the weapons on the walls and the pictures, touching the carved staircase with my hands. A black figure stood waiting for me at the head of the stairs, the hollow eyes watching me intently from the white skull's face. I looked around for the stolid Frith, but he had passed along the hall into the further corridor. I was now alone with Mrs. Danvers. I went up the great stairs toward her, and she waited motionless, her hands folded before her, her eyes never leaving my face. I summoned a smile, which was not returned. Not did I blame her, for there was no purpose to the smile. It was a silly thing, bright and artificial. I hope I haven't kept you waiting, I said. It's for you to make your own time, madam, she answered. I am here to carry out your orders. And then she turned, through the archway of the gallery, to the corridor behind. We went along a broad, carpeted passage, and then turned left, through an oak door, and down a narrow flight of stairs, and up a corresponding flight, and out so another door. This she flung open, standing aside to let me pass, and I came into a little anteroom or boudoir, furnished with a sofa, stairs, and writing desk, which opened out to a large double bedroom with wide windows and a bathroom beyond. I went at once to the window and looked out. The rose garden lay below, and the eastern part of the terrace, while beyond the rose garden rose a smooth grass bank stretching out to the near woods. You can't see the sea from here, then? I said, turning to Mrs. Danvers. No, not from this wing, she answered. You can't even hear it either. You would not know the sea was anywhere near, not from this wing. She spoke in a peculiar way, as though something lay behind her words, and she laid an emphasis on the words, this wing, as if suggesting that the suite where we stood now held some inferiority. Sorry about that. I like the sea, I said. She did not answer. She just went on staring at me, her hands folded before her. However, it's a very charming room, I said, and I'm sure I shall be comfortable. I understand that it's been done up for our return? Yes, she said. What was it like before? I asked. It had mauve paper and different hangings. Mr. De Winter did not think it very cheerful. It was never much used except for special visitors. But Mr. De Winter gave special orders on his letter that you should have this room. Then this was not his bedroom originally? I said. No, madam, he's never used the rooms in this wing before. Oh, you didn't tell me that. And I wandered to the dressing table and began combing my hair. My things were already unpacked, my brushes and comb upon the tray. I was glad Maxim had given me a set of brushes and that they were laid out upon the dressing table for Mrs. Danvers to see. They were new. They'd cost money. I need not be ashamed of them. Alice has unpacked for you and will look after you until your maid arrives, said Mrs. Danvers. I smiled at her again. I put down the brush on the dressing table. I don't have a maid, I said awkwardly. I'm sure Alice, if she is the housemaid, will look after me all right. She wore the same expression that she had done on our first meeting. Then I dropped my gloves so gauchely on the floor. I'm afraid that would not do for very long, she said. It's usual, you know, for ladies in your position to have a personal maid. I flushed and reached for my brush again. There was a sting in her words I understood too well. If you think it necessary, perhaps you could see about it for me, I said, avoiding her eyes. Some young girl, perhaps, wanting to train? If you wish, she said. It's for you to say. There was a silence between us, and I wished she would go away. I wondered why she must go on standing there, watching me, her hands folded on her black dress. I suppose you have been at Manderley for many years, I said, making a fresh effort. Longer than anyone else? Not so long as Frith, she said, and I thought how lifeless her voice was, how cold, like her hand when it had lain in mine. Frith was here when the old gentleman was living, when Mr. De Winter was a boy. I see, so you did not come till after that? No, she said, not till after that. Once more I glanced up at her, and once more I met her eyes, dark and somber in that white face of hers, instilling into me, I knew not why, a strange feeling of disquiet, of foreboding. I tried to smile and could not. I found myself held up by those eyes that had no flicker of sympathy towards me. I came here when the first Mrs. De Winter was a bride, she said, and her voice, which had hitherto, as I said, been dull and toneless, was harsh now, with an unexpected animation, with life and meaning, and there was a spot of color on the gaunt cheekbones. The change was so sudden I was shocked and a little scared. I did not know what to do or what to say. It was as though she had spoken words that were unforbidden, words that she had hidden within herself for a long time and now could be repressed no longer. Still her eyes never left my face. They looked upon me with a curious mixture of pity and of scorn, until I felt myself to be even younger and more untutored in the ways of life than I had ever been. I could see she despised me, marking with all the snobbery of her class that I was no great lady, that I was humble, shy, and diffident. Yet there was something besides scorn in those eyes of hers, something surely of positive dislike or actual malice. I had to say something. I could not go on sitting there, playing with my hairbrush, letting her see how much I feared and mistrusted her. Mrs. Danvers, I heard myself saying, I hope we shall be friends and come to understand one another. You must have patience with me, you know, because this sort of life is new to me. I have lived rather differently, and I do want to make a success of it, and above all, to make Mr. De Winter happy. I know I can leave all household arrangements to you. Mr. De Winter said so, and you must run things as they have always been run. I shan't want to make any changes. I stopped, a little breathless, a little uncertain of myself and whether I was saying the right thing, and when I looked up again, I saw that she had moved and was standing with her hand on the handle of the door. Very good, she said. I hope I shall do everything to your satisfaction. The house has been in my charge now for more than a year, and Mr. De Winter has never complained. It was very different, of course, when the late Mrs. De Winter was alive. There was a lot of entertaining then, a lot of parties, and though I managed for her, she liked to supervise things herself. Once again, I had the impression that she chose her words with care, that she was feeling her way, as it were, into my mind and watching for the effect I had upon my face. I would rather leave it to you, I repeated, much rather. And into her face came the same expression I had noticed before when I first had shaken hands with her in the hall, a look surely of derision, of definite contempt. She knew that I would never withstand her, and that I feared her too. Can I do anything more for you? She said, and I pretended to glance around the room. No, I said. No, I think I have everything. I shall be very comfortable here. You have made the room so charming. This last final crawling sop to win her approval. She shrugged her shoulders and still did not smile. I only followed out Mr. De Winter's instructions, she said. She hesitated by the doorway, her hand on the handle of the open door. It was as though she still had something to say to me and could not decide upon the words, yet waited there for me to give her an opportunity. I wished she would go. She was like a shadow standing there, watching me, appraising me with her hollow eyes set in that dead skull's face. If you find anything not to your liking, you will tell me at once? Yes, I said, of course, Miss Danvers. But I knew this was not what she meant to say, and silence fell between us again. If Mr. De Winter asked for his big wardrobe, she said suddenly, you must tell him it was impossible to move. We tried, but we could not get it through these narrow doorways. These are smaller rooms than those in the west wing. If he doesn't like the arrangement of this suite, he must tell me. It was difficult to know how to furnish these rooms. Please don't worry, Mrs. Danvers, I said. I'm sure he will be pleased with everything. But I'm sorry it's given you so much trouble. I had no idea he was having rooms redecorated and furnished. He shouldn't have bothered. I'm sure I would have just been as happy in the west wing. She looked at me curiously and began twisting the handle of the door. Mr. De Winter said you would prefer to be on this side. The rooms in the west wing are very old. The bedroom in the big suite is twice as large as this, a very beautiful room, too, with a scrolled ceiling. The tapestry chairs are very valuable, and so is the carved mantelpiece. It is the most beautiful room in the house, and the windows look down across the lawns to the sea. I felt uncomfortable, a little shy. I did not know why she must speak with me in that undercurrent of resentment, implying as she did with the same time that this room, where I found myself to be so installed, was somewhat inferior, not up to standard, a second-rate room, as it were, for a second-rate person. I suppose Mr. De Winter keeps the most beautiful room to show the public, I said. She went on twisting the handle of the door and then looked up at me again, catching my eyes, hesitating before replying, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter even and more toneless than it had been before. The bedrooms are never shown to the public, she said, only the hall and the gallery and the rooms below. She paused an instant, feeling me with her eyes. They used to live on the west wing and use those rooms when Mrs. De Winter was alive. That big room I was telling you about that looked out to the sea was Mrs. De Winter's bedroom. Then I saw a shadow flit upon her face, and she drew back against the wall, effacing herself as a step sounded outside and Maxim came into the room. "How is it?" he said to me. "All right? You think you'll like it?" He looked around with enthusiasm, pleased as a schoolboy. "I always thought this was a most attractive room," he said. "It was wasted all those years as a guest room, but I have always thought it had possibilities. You've done a great success, Mrs. Danvers. I give you full marks." "Thank you, sir," she said, her face expressionless, and then she turned and went out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Maxim went and leant out of the window. "I love the rose garden," he said. "One of the first things I remember is walking after my mother on very small, unsteady legs while she picked off the dead heads of the roses. There's something peaceful and happy about this room, and it's quiet, too. You can never tell you were in 5 minutes of the sea from this room." "That's what Mrs. Danvers said." He came away from the window. He prowled about the room, touching things, looking at the pictures, opening wardrobes, fingering my clothes, already unpacked. "How'd you get along with Miss Old Danvers?" he said abruptly. I turned away and began combing my hair again before the looking-glass. "She seems just a little bit stiff," I said after a moment or two. "Perhaps she thought I was going to interfere with the running of the house." "I don't think she would mind your doing that," he said. I looked up and saw him watching my reflection in the looking-glass, and then he turned away and went over to the window again, whistling quietly, under his breath, rocking backwards and forwards on his heel. "Don't mind her," she said. "She's an extraordinary character in many ways, and possibly not very easy for another woman to get on with. You mustn't worry about it. If she really makes herself a nuisance, we'll get rid of her. But she's efficient, you know, and will take all this housekeeping worries out of your hands. I dare say she's a bit of a bully to the staff. She doesn't dare bully me, though. I'd have given her the sack long ago if she had tried. I expect we shall get on very well when she knows me better. After all, it's natural enough that she should resent me a bit at first." "Resent you? Why resent you? What the devil do you mean?" he said. He turned away from the window, frowning, an odd, half-empty expression on his face. I wondered why he should mind, and I wish I had said something else. "I mean, it must be easier for a housekeeper to look after a man alone, and I dare say she had got into the way of doing it, and perhaps she was afraid I should be very overbearing." "Overbearing? Thank God," he began. "If you think—" And then he stopped, and he came across to me and kissed me on the top of my head. "Let's forget about Mrs. Danvers," he said. "She doesn't interest me very much, I'm afraid. Come along and let me show you something of Manderley." I did not see Mrs. Danvers again that evening, and we did not talk about her any more. I felt happier when I had dismissed her from my thoughts than less of an interloper, and as we wandered about the rooms downstairs and looked at the pictures, and Maxim put his arm around my shoulder, I began to feel more like the self I wanted to become, the self I had pictured in my dreams who made Manderley her home. My footsteps no longer sounded foolish on the stone flags of the hall, for Maxim's nailed shoes made far more noise than mine, and the pattering feet of the 2 dogs was a comfortable, pleasing note. I was glad, too, because it was the first evening, and we had only been back a little while, and the showing of the pictures had taken time, when Maxim, looking at the clock, said it was too late to change for dinner, so I was spared the embarrassment of Alice, the maid, asking what I should wear, and of her helping me to dress, and myself walking along that flight of stairs to the hall, cold, with bare shoulders, in a dress that Mrs. Van Hopper had given me because it did not suit her daughter. I dreaded the formality of dinner in that austere dining room, and now, because of the little fact that we had not changed, it was quite all right, quite easy. just the same as when we had dined together in restaurants. I was comfortable in my stockinette dress. I laughed and talked about things we had seen in Italy and France. We even had the snapshots on the table, and Frith and the footman were impersonable people, as the waiters had been. They did not stare at me as Mrs. Danvers had done. We sat in the library after dinner, and presently the curtains were drawn and more logs thrown on the fire. It was cool for May, and I was thankful for the warmth that came from the steady burning logs. It was new for us to sit together like this after dinner, for in Italy we had wandered about, walked or driven, gone into little cafes, leant over bridges. Maxim made instinctively now for the chair on the left of the open fireplace and stretched out his hand for the papers. He settled one of the broad cushions behind his head and lit a cigarette. This is routine, I thought. This is what he always does. And this has been his custom now for years. He did not look at me. He went on reading his paper, contented, comfortable, having assumed his way of living, the master of his house. And as I sat there, brooding, my chin in my hands, fondling the soft ears of one of the spaniels, it came to me that I was not the first one to lounge here in possession of the chair. Someone had been here before me, had certainly left an imprint of her person on the cushions and on the arm where her hand had rested. Another one had poured the coffee from that same silver coffee pot, had placed the cup to her lips, had bent down to the dog even as I was doing. Unconsciously I shivered, as though someone had opened the door behind me and let a draught into the room. I was sitting in Rebecca's chair. I was leaning against Rebecca's cushion, and the dog had come to me and laid his head upon my knee because that had been his custom, and he remembered, in the past, she had given his sugar to him there. There we have it. Hi, Elaine. I don't know if you're still with us, but welcome. So we just finished chapter 7. This is the version I'm reading from again. If you would like to join, I think we're picking this up again next Tuesday. So I will see you then, and I look forward to it. Thank you guys for joining, and we will see you next time. Bye. Once I can find the thing. Okay, now I'm leaving. Bye.